Ladies and gentlemen, this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be discussing how Sony can improve the PlayStation 4 over time. And the thing we're going to be mostly targeting in this particular video is the clock speed of the GPU. Microsoft, of course, increased the Xbox One's GPU from 800 MHz all the way up to 853. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the architecture of both systems, both the PS4 and the Xbox One were running exactly the same GPU clock speed. That's the graphics processor, not the CPU. Both 800 MHz. Now, of course, Microsoft have done some would claim to be a subtle bump, but still it is a bump of clock speed from 800 to 853. And the reason, of course, that Microsoft were able to do that is that they were under the heat and power thresholds that they were initially expecting. In other words, they were a bit too cautious, and because they were overly cautious, it's better to be overly cautious and then you can tweak things later on rather than getting everyone's hopes up. And so in this case, they were able to then ramp the speed from 800 to 853, which gave them from about 1.23/1.24 T-flops to just about 1.31, 1.32. So it's a pretty decent increase in performance. It's not exactly going to set the world alight, but still, one thing that Mark Cerny and his team have consistently said is they want the console to feel fresh and improve over time. And you can do some analysis of this. We've done some already regarding the PlayStation 4's memory architecture, and we've mentioned quite heavily about how developers have said that, you know, they've got a substantial amount of memory to work with, but Sony have said that, you know, in the future this can change. In other words, the amount of memory that's allocated, reserved for the operating system, in other words, will most likely change over time. And this is just how they did with the PlayStation 3. They were able to claw back memory. In this case, they've basically said, well, here's the amount of memory you've got to work with right now, but in the future, you know, we'll give you more, whatever that turns out to be. It could be that they give them, you know, 6.5 gigs, could be 7 gigs, whatever it turns out to be. In other words, they feel that the console is supposed to evolve over time, which makes sense. So that, of course, begs the main question: what type of clock speed increases could we see, and what type of performance would we see from those as well? So once again, all this stuff is hypothetical. It's not been confirmed or anything by Sony, but I thought it would be quite interesting just to take a look at anyway. Now, I have already put out a video. You guys can actually Google this. You could probably just search T-flops on the channel or calculating T-flops and it will pop right up. And it actually shows you guys quite in depth how to actually calculate the performance of the Xbox One and PlayStation 4 GPUs, as well as AMD GCN architecture, which both are based on. As a slight aside, I've actually just written in C++ an application to do all the math for you. So I'm going to be making that freely available over the next couple of days as well. It's by no means a particularly complicated program, but it works out quite nicely. And as I said in that video, it's not particularly difficult to calculate the T-flops once you know the maths on how it all comes together. It's actually fairly simple maths. It's, you know, not like it requires even algebra or anything like that. It's pretty much just the times of basic integers, so it's fairly easy to comprehend. And what we could do with that, once of course we've got the specifications, is mimic, performance increases, and we can just use that to calculate. So just for a moment, let's figure out that, of course, the Xbox One has about 1.32 T-flops, and the PlayStation 4 currently has 1.84. Now, in case anyone's wondering why there's such a large disparity, I have covered this in depth, of course, in other videos, but I'm just going to, for those of you who aren't regular viewers, or maybe you've missed other tech videos or, you know, tech articles from other websites or whatever, I'll quickly go into that. Of course, that's all down to the amount of GCN cores inside the PlayStation 4's APU. The APU, of course, is basically a SoC or system on a chip, where the PS4's CPU, which is AMD Jaguar, and the GPU, which of course are the GCN cores, are GCN, by the way, means Graphics Core Next, just so you're aware. I have done a lot of analysis on this stuff, so you guys can Google that or check out my channel for more stuff. But basically, In the Xbox One, there are 12, and in the PS4, there's 18, in case you're wondering why there's such a disparity between them. It's mostly because the Xbox One has the Move engines inside and the ES RAM, in other words, the the 32 megabytes of fast memory, which helps to make up for the fact that it doesn't have the GDDR5 in it. But that's a slightly different topic, and once again, I've covered all of this in PS4 versus Xbox One GPU, which goes into nauseating detail of the stuff. So let's now just focus on the clock speed increase. So, as it turns out, there's quite a bit of a increase if you ramp up the clock speed of the PS4's GPU. In other words, you get more mileage out of it. Why do you get more mileage out of it? Just for those of you who are not quite sure why, think of it this way. If I was to say to you, add 10% to 100, and then I was to say to you, add 10% to, let's go with 500, what's the bigger 10%? And obviously it's 500, and the reason behind that, the reason that the 10% of the 500 would be a larger number, is quite simple. It's a larger number to begin with. So in other words, you're increasing the percentage of an already larger number. In this case, on the PlayStation, it's not that the clock speed's faster. It's not that there's some magical, jelly bean in there that's causing it to sprout. No, it's not. Of course, it's just simply because it does have those extra GCN cores. We've also spoken about compute as well, but we're not really going to discuss that just for a moment in this video. We're going to focus on just the really, really basic stuff. So, if you were to times the PS4's GPU clock speed, or not times them, so if you were to increase it from the 800 megahertz to 853, which would be exactly the same as the PlayStation 4's rival, the Xbox One, you get a number of about 1.965. I'll say that again, 1.965 T-flops, which is an improvement of about 125 G-flops, gigaflops in other words, which is not too shabby. For those of you who are wondering what type of performance increase Microsoft got, the numbers are roughly about 80 G-flops for the Xbox One, and an increase of about 125 G-flops for the PS4. Once again, these are pretty rough, and that's only because, of course, that we see the extra 50% of GCN cores inside the Xbox, inside the PlayStation 4. These are rough numbers anyway, not exactly 100%. But, so it's quite a disparity, but it's still under the 2 T-flops, and a lot of people were really hoping for 2 T-flops, and to actually get that, they're going to have to break the 900 megahertz barrier, at least to be able to break it comfortably. It's around the 870 to 880 megahertz that they really start to cross over the 2 T-flop threshold. Regardless, we've spoken about just some numbers just to band about for some fun and for the sake of discussion. By no means are they 100% accurate, but bigger question is, how likely is it that Sony can do this? Personally speaking, I think pretty likely. How would they do it? Would be fairly simple, of course. It would simply be an update to the console's actual, operating system. They would just release like a flash, and it would update, and then a system update basically, and then Bob's your uncle, done. And this, of course, would most likely be done in a couple of years' time. It's fairly well known that the PS4 operates pretty cool. The Xbox One, same thing. We know, of course, that Microsoft have been pretty stringent when it comes to power requirements, and this is the thing. Both consoles, very cool, very quiet from what we understand. This is contrary, of course, to earlier rumors with the Xbox One, but it appears that no, Microsoft are going to be a pretty low noise, low power, and more to the point, low heat output device. And that's kind of what you want. You don't, for example, if you're playing like a Blu-ray movie, you do want the device to be able to operate in a very low power mode. You don't want the fan to start kicking to 100% when you're just, watching something, or even when you're playing a game. And it's kind of annoying. slight aside, a little bit of a tangent, if you will. My fat, I suppose you could call it, old PlayStation 3. I've got one of the original 40GB models. I've upgraded the hard drive a little bit, but still, it's still an old one. And for the most part, it's fairly quiet until you play certain games, like one of them that just makes the system cry in the corner and beg for me to stop would be The Last of Us. Obviously, I'm in the UK, and some of you may know we actually hit pretty hot temperatures for the UK, especially when you consider that we don't have air conditioning. You have like a desk fan, and that does the fantastic job of moving more hot air around. So congratulations, you've moved hot air from point A to point B rather than actually introducing cooler air. For most homes, anyway. Some homes do have it, but just most don't, including mine, unfortunately. And the side effect for this is, of course, that the fans on the PlayStation, I think that's about the first time I've actually heard the system become quite noisy. And apparently, from what I understand, once the system goes over 60 degrees, that's when you start getting the infamous, but not quite so infamous as the RROD, Red Ring of Death. You start getting the yellow light of death, which is pretty much the same thing. It's just their way of saying, yup, you're boned, you've overheated your system, which is all to do, of course, with cooling. But regardless, obviously Sony aren't stupid. I don't think Microsoft are either, but that's focused just for a moment on Sony. I don't think they're stupid. They're going to, of course, do rigorous testing internally in a variety of different climates to make sure that, okay, if we release a BIOS update, what type of effect is that going to have? In other words, what percentage of our customers who have a system, particularly those who live in either a hot climate or those who keep their console in a really poorly ventilated area, just as a slight aside for a moment, because obviously it does address exactly the same point, Microsoft have said that, look, we cannot stop customers from being silly or abusing the system. In other words, having really dusty rooms or blocking air vents or putting it under under the TV with tons of wires around it. The type of thing that I'm talking about. Everyone does it at some point or another. No one can be 100%, For example, there might be, you've had like a game on top and the manual falls out and blocks one of the air vents. This is abuse at the end of the day to the console. And obviously, sometimes it may be unintentional. You might not realize your cat, for example, is sitting on the console because it likes a nice warm, air coming out, whatever it is. But they have to somewhat legislate against that. And so Sony will, of course, do the same internal testing as well, and they'll say, you know what, here's the temperature, here's the clock speeds that we can get, and obviously I'm just pulling 850 because Microsoft settled on that. So of course we know that the actual silicon itself is more than capable of doing this. The silicon itself actually is more than capable of actually going over 900, even 1000 megahertz is actually its general speaking maximum speed for the GCN architecture, the 7000 range, of course, for desktops. And if you were to Google AMD 7970, which is one of the top end cards in the 7000 range, by all means it's not the highest range card, but it's one of the top end ones, you can see that you're at the 1000 megahertz kind of range, which theoretically, in a magical fantasy world full of unicorns, that the Xbox One and the PS4's GPUs could, of course, be ramped up to those speeds, but in reality it can't, of course, because of the other concerns they have, such as heat, reliability, the fact it's an APU, and of course, if you're inside like a massive ass PC case, which I'm assuming most of you would have if you have a high-end GPU, it's not really. Of course, you can do it in like small shuttle cases, but generally it's better not to. Generally, it's better to put them in like larger ones. That's why, for example, the mobile versions of the 7970, if you actually take a look at them, they're actually really different in terms of specifications. They're actually far under what the desktop derivative is, which I kind of don't like that. I kind of don't like the fact that they actually call it the Mobile 7970, because that's not really that accurate in terms of terminology or naming conventions. That's a slight pet peeve of mine. It would be more accurate to say that it's the mobile version of the 7950 or something, but, whatever. You guys can check that out. I have done an article on the GPUs, the 7970, the mobile and the desktop versus the PS4. You guys can Google that or go on Red Gamer Tag. It's up to you. The big discussion, of course, is just how much of a difference any of this would make. I mean, for example, let's say they were to get it to 850 megahertz. How much of a difference is that? Well, in terms of pure GPU performance, and we're talking about graphics processing just for a moment. We're not talking about compute functionalities. We're just talking about the ability to shift pixels slash, polygons slash whatever around on screen. In other words, throw its, pretty lighting or whatever up. It's quite a difference. I mean, for example, the Xbox 360's GPU was capable of about 250 G-flops. There's a slight debate in that, but about 250 G-flops. And so, if, for example, you were to hit about the 120, 125 range, you're basically saying, okay, well, I'm going to give you guys an extra half an Xbox 360. Of course, it's not quite like that, but it just does for a basic analogy. One other benefit, of course, and we have somewhat briefly mentioned it in this video, but another benefit, of course, of the extra GPU power would be that naturally, not only does it increase the ability to throw around polygons, as we've discussed quite heavily, but more to the point, also compute. And we do know that Mark Cerny, along with most of the other development team, no doubt, behind the PlayStation 4, but specifically Mark Cerny, as he's been very vocal on his vision of what he believes the compute should and will be able to do. He believes that, of course, it will grow over time, but it makes sense that this is one of the primary ways that they can do this. And obviously, the PS4's GPU has undergone some significant special treatment, let's say, for the PS4, in that it has been much better tailored towards compute, as much better able to queue up instructions so that they can be processed while the GPU's being less utilized for graphics. In other words, it's able to queue up the commands much more efficiently. I've done a lot more on this on other videos. I'm not going to really bother to speak about stuff I've already spoken about very heavily because it gets really boring for regular viewers, and it would also cheat out new viewers because it would be pretty much impossible for me to cram it all in this video. But I have done it in an Xbox One versus PS4 GPU comparison. I believe it's called Compute or something like that, so you can check that out if you want more information on how compute works specifically on the PlayStation 4. It gives you a lot more details. So in this case, of course, if they were to increase the GPU clock speed, it would naturally improve the compute functionality of the PS4, which in turn would allow it to do a lot more stuff with compute, such as, of course, the stuff we've already discussed previously, such as physics, ray tracing, for example, AI, and goodness knows what else. There's so many different uses for physics now. Even stuff like collision detection is becoming huge, and the GPU is just naturally better because of the parallel computing environment. It's just much better at processing certain commands. That's just how it is, of course, because of the SIMD architecture. So, is that all there is to this? No, there's a couple of other bits and pieces that I'm going to discuss in an upcoming video. It's going to be mostly on the APIs and drivers. I'm not quite sure when I'm going to be putting that one out, probably over the next couple of days. But that's really gone into the hardware, but this is really going into the hardware stuff. One thing I do want to also touch upon is the memory clocks. A couple of people have actually been discussing, do I think that the clock speed of the memory will increase at all to help facilitate the increase in clock speed of the GPU? And to be honest with you, I don't really think so. I think that it's most likely that they feel that they've got enough memory bandwidth. Maybe they will do a very slight increase, but personally I don't really think that's going to be the case. I think that the memory clock speeds are going to remain pretty consistent, actually. Obviously, Microsoft haven't said, oh, okay, by the way, we're running DDR3 or ESRAM faster. However, one thing we do know about the Xbox One, it's a point of huge amounts of contention in regards to the ESRAM, is the way it does read and write. Originally, they didn't think it was going to be able to read and write so efficiently. I have covered this in another video. I know I keep saying that, but a lot of the stuff is really complicated stuff, and I don't want to go on like a 20-minute tangent just to explain something as well as it should be explained, because if I just kind of touch on it, it just leaves everyone confused. So people have asked me just to say, you know what, just point us to another video, and if I've not done a video on it, I will try to give a brief explanation on stuff. I think that's, generally speaking, the best way. If I feel as well that there's a point that needs to be addressed much better, I'll make another video on it. I think that's much more fair for everyone involved. There's another thing as well I'm starting to do. If anyone asks really complicated questions on Facebook, I generally try to make videos out of it, because it's sometimes you guys point something out that I hadn't actually thought of, and that requires me to actually do some analysis and digging on it. So rather than just benefit one person, I figure I might as well, benefit as many people as possible. Anyway, where was I? Oh yeah, the memory. So of course Microsoft do believe that they've got a much more efficient system, but they have not increased the clock speed or anything like that, so I don't really think Sony are going to require it. The AMD Jaguar, of course, I'm talking about the actual CPU side of things. Sorry guys, one of my plastic bottles decided it wants to expand a little bit. The AMD Jaguar, of course, has about 20 gigabytes per second. Once again, I emphasize the word about, because this is that magical fantasy land of developers aren't exactly categorically denying it, but they're not confirming it either, because they're under that horrible, horrible, horrible agreement known as an NDA, and so they can't say anything more than, yeah, it's, roughly that. Which is kind of infuriating, but there you have it. So let's just assume it's 20 gigabytes per second until, 3 months later it turns out to be 18 or 24 or whatever. But let's just use the figure of 20 because it's a nice round number anyway to abuse and make into our bitch. So in this case, of course, that means they've got about 156, unless my math absolutely sucks. No, I don't think so. Seems about right. So I don't really think they're going to have too much of a problem in that respect. I don't really think the PS4 is going to be too memory bandwidth constrained anyway. Just as a very basic point of comparison, and by no means is this completely technically accurate, it's just something to think about. The 7970 that we've discussed very heavily before uses 264 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth. That's the maximum, however. And once again, a lot of this stuff can be tuned very extensively depending on the manufacturer's brand and stuff. So it could be that your particular one might have like a little bit more speed in it, whatever. But generally speaking, the manufacturer's recommended, in which case, of course, AMD, is 264 gigabytes per second. That's 1375 megahertz of core clock, which is 5.5 Gbps, by the way, just in case you're curious, and that's, of course, GDDR5 RAM. Just to give you a comparison, that's 3.79 T-flops of single precision compute power, which is just about double what the PS4's GPU. Not quite, but I'm just, using basics here. We're not going to go too much into, one G-flop or a couple of hundred, or 100 G-flops or whatever, because that just gets a bit over the top for this, just a very basic video. And so I don't really think memory bandwidth is going to be huge. One issue, of course, that the PS4's memory bandwidth is going to be sucked up a lot more upon is the compute functionality, but I don't really think that's going to be too much of a huge deal. We do know that they've got a pretty decent amount of cache on the GPU anyway, so I don't think it's going to be too bad. Another benefit, of course, would it also improve, for example, the ROPS and their output, but I don't really think that's going to be a massive deal anyway. They've got 32 ROPS on the PS4, which is more than the Xbox One, and the Xbox One's not really going to be struggling in terms of ROPS anyway. The more ROPS you have, by the way, is an indicator of fill rate, pixel fill rate. I have discussed this before, but I'll quickly give a brief analysis since it's quite important. They're basically raster operators, and they're linked to cute stuff such as anti-aliasing, filter effects, that type of thing. And basically, the more you have, the better it is. 16, however, largely is okie dokie for 1080p. 1920 by 1080, although there is some debate, of course, as we've gone into previously, on exactly what the internal resolutions of some of the Xbox One games are going to end up being, but that's a separate issue. As I said, we've discussed that in the GPU series, the Xbox One versus PS4 GPU series. So I don't really think it's going to be a huge deal, but obviously more ROP performance isn't exactly being like, oh, okay, well, I certainly don't want that. But we'll have to see, I think. I think for the PlayStation, however, it's a fairly good indication that I don't think it's going to have any particular issues with memory bandwidth. Clock speed of the AMD Jaguars is a little bit more tricky. From what we understand, and this has been from a technical analysis and knowledge we have of the actual internal documents and stuff, of the actual release documents of the AMD Jaguar. So according to AMD themselves, you do some math on it, and basically if you increase the clock speed of the Jaguar to 2 gigahertz, which is not exactly huge if you think about it, it's 400 megahertz. What's that? Well, it basically increases the TDP. Let's just go say heat and power type of situations by about 66%, which is pretty massive. I wouldn't be surprised, however, if we do see a subtle increase in clock speed. However, most likely, I wouldn't be surprised as well if we see the PlayStation 4 free up one of the CPUs. As we know, one of the CPUs is actually, or two of the CPUs, I'm sorry, are both being utilized for operating system functionality. It's possible that they'll do their best to free this up, and this will probably be a software level update. And we're not sure, of course, when this is going to happen, but I wouldn't be surprised if that happens rather than a clock speed increase. But I guess we'll have to see on that one. I think they'll want to be a bit cautious, because obviously if they increase both, it's going to be a fairly substantial increase in the console's heat output and also power draw, because obviously, I'm sure many of you know this anyway, but if you start increasing the the clock speed of something, it usually linearly at the start, but then obviously it gets a lot more steeper, but the power curve also starts to go up as well. So in other words, the faster it is, the more power it starts to eat up, and that's obviously bad when you're trying to design a low power / quiet machine, especially when you consider that the Jaguars themselves are meant to be operating in a fairly cool environment. In other words, they are not something like a Pentium 4, where it's quite happy to operate at like 70 plus degrees for extended periods of time. Anyway, that's just about it for this particular video. I think I've covered everything. There are still more things we're going to cover in the future. That's mostly going to be software related. But I just wanted to give you guys some food for thought. I mean, I personally believe that it's a very good bet that Sony are going to be increasing the clock speed in the future of the PlayStation 4, but I think they're saving it. I think there's a lot of stuff that Sony are saving currently for future expansion of the console, to keep the console constantly fresh and let's say exciting for developers, because that's a very important part of it. You can't just have a static platform. Well, you can, of course, that's one of the benefits of a console, but we're talking about, obviously, if you could offer them a bit more performance down the line, that's always a bonus. Anyway, I think that's just about it for this particular video. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. I will see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.